Thank you so much for having us. I don't think that I can add more to what you've already perhaps shared with us. First of all, I'm a Palestinian born in Badawi camp. It's a camp, a refugee camp in North Lebanon. My father and his family were originally from Haifa, and they were also sadly forced out of Palestine. My father was, in fact, around 8 when his family arrived in Lebanon. My mother, which is something that I've written about, in fact, my mother was born en route. So during the Exodus, during the Palestinian catastrophe, the Nakba. So in fact, her parents, my grandparents, deferred naming her. They didn't name her because they had assumed that she wouldn't survive the journey, that she wouldn't survive the Exodus. So her name, which is Khayzuran, which is the equivalent of the term bamboo, is her simply because she survived the journey and also because of her malleability as a child refugee. I was born in Badawi. I was educated at UNRWA schools, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency schools, and I did my my BA and Masters in Lebanon at the Lebanese University before coming to the UK as an asylum seeker. And of course, securing some kind of residency. The moment I I had my status, I applied for positions. I used to be a teacher at UNRWA schools, so I mainly did a bit of teaching, and then I started teaching for the university here, the University of Oxford, and I started my PhD. And in fact, I completed it successfully a couple of months ago. And I'm also a poet. I used to write in Arabic. I still do because I translate from English into Arabic. But now mainly I use English. And this is in fact not because I don't want to write in Arabic, but simply because I feel the need to write also and be able to share what I'm writing, and not to write and then wait for this writing to be translated or to be rendered into other languages. Today, I'm going to read from my 2 books. The first book is Writing the Camp, which is, I would say, perhaps what they call autoethnography, or maybe a writing back or a writing afresh of the refugee camp into literature. And from my position, my positionality as a refugee, as a Palestinian refugee who was born in a refugee camp. I'm going to start with a poem that has to do with just simply living in the camp, but also how we view the camp as refugees. And the title of this poem, The Camp, Is It Possible? And this possibility, I think, has to do with how this temporary construction, which was meant to be temporary, has transcended its time and become a place for various times. So the camp, is it possible? When she gave birth to me, we bartered hands to caress time in time. She says in the voice of the absent, noise is the ornament and the story, and the sleeping thing at the threshold is for me, despite me. At the time my father was oiling his gun with the cooking oil gifted to us, a passerby at the other end of the camp was killed by a stray bullet. 2 buckets half full, and as many sheets ripped in haste from castaway things sufficed for us to cry together. I am circumcised amongst the circumcised. To recognize myself, I remember my body as I have never seen it. Is not circumcision in the camp a meaning for the future? Circumcision, what is it? The cut that is already cut, the curse in the flesh, as it pronounced by the sleeping and the mad, the flesh stirred at before it is severed. Does the cut not announce birth to become an utterance? Memory survives the uttered. For the sacrificial before sacrifice, we planted ourselves next to their scarecrows, faces for the arid. I write the camp memories as scattered as our rationed flour in the congested veins of my mother as she pushes the seasonally borrowed cart towards our wide open mouths, the once lived life dusted off, polished for the written in memory. According to her, my father did not cry, but to feign crying, he drowned himself in our tears. Whoever gives birth in the camp gives birth to the archive in the shape of a flesh. I'm going to read another poem from this book, Writing the Camp. A poem, in fact, which has to do with hosting and how refugee camps, which is something that really fascinates me, but also heartens me here, that is also home for other refugee groups. We have Palestinians, of course, but we also have Kurds, we also have Iraqis, we also have Syrians. So this camp is also a place for hosting. And of course, not to idealize these circumstances. And here I would refer myself to Derrida and trying to work on this tension between hospitality and hostility. And he came up with the coinage, hospitality. So what I'm trying here to do is simply to capture bits of the camp, but also the camp that has become larger than itself. Once I asked my mother, "Mother, in the absence of a place, who invites who?" She looked at me and said, with a concerned tone of voice, "My son has gone mad. Hurry, hurry up, summon the Imam to recite over him." It is the tremor in the hand that invites. My grandmother in Nahr al-Barid camp used to squeeze our little hands whenever we appeared at her doorstep and say, "How did you leave the camp?" We never answered. In intention, the prevalent tense is the past. We never listened to my mother and always insisted, on swallowing the chewing gum, thinking that it might one day become a balloon that would transfer us to God? Is the memory of the camp not the camp? Suddenly, our senile neighbor stuffed her memories in a plastic bag and left in the bomb shelter in the Dawi camp. In complete darkness, my mother, to ensure we were by her side, would count us, not knowing that most of the time, the children she was tapping and uttering the number of belonged to other families. The man, whose sister is also my sister, once asked me, who is older, God or the camp? The camp has its own sky. When people shoot in the air in happiness and in despair, it is to kill the bird that is never there. My father, who has persisted in writing since a young age, has not published a single thing. In his beige room, with eyes trying to see, he showed me one of the magazines with a poem of his that bore somebody else's name. We look at it to see what it is that is not ill. And I'll conclude my part here with a couple of poems from my book, excuse me, please. My book, Eating the Archive, which is premised on aid and how aid, in fact, is, or the perishable, which is gifted to us by the United Nations, is a processed, handled, but also preserved and consumed at a later date. So it's quite, in fact, perhaps interesting to expand and push the parameters of the archive and how this popular archive, which is taking place in a living archive, i.e. the camp, is in fact growing with time. I'm going to read a short poem, and the title is The War. The War. I am all ears. The bombs I still hear through me, the air raids since time, the gravel's flight from somewhere to nowhere, to what will become of dust, particles, those of dissipation, the malevolent in sounds, the creaking of the door, a gun, the barest of thuds, a raid, a death worthy of its name. And just to maybe to end this intervention, I'll read just one more poem, and also to counter and respond to the war. And the title of this poem is On Living. But also it has to do with our life as refugees, but also it sheds light on this perhaps discreet and indiscreet resistance within the camp, and how people affiliate themselves with political parties and exist, in fact, in conjunction with other people within the camp. And it refers also to UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. On living. In the Communist Party headquarters, where my father and eldest brother were members, the only pan used for frying eggs and cooking was a piece of metal cut from a box where weapons were once kept. Then I was too young to come to terms with death and to see death in a light that would be slightly less dim than ours, to toughen me up and expose me to as many dead faces as he could. My brother would drag me along all the funerals he could get hold of. While he was busy chattering, I guardedly unloosened the shroud wrapped over our grandmother's body. The first time I held a gun was when I decided to shoot time at close range. After school, or after school, when all visitors had finished with us and the camp, I would ascend to the Jebel to play with friends. The Jebel was not a mountain, but the arid stretch of land outside the camp where hiding from air raids and the sky was never possible. There are a few bomb shelters in the camp. Some are requisitioned as houses. Some remain buried under the UNRWA schools. The rest are for the future. Thank you.
Maybe I need to begin by acknowledging maybe a feeling, no? And since what's happening in Gaza is happening, I have to admit that maybe the feeling that is a bit surrounding me is a feeling of powerlessness, and in somehow as an architect, maybe most probably even female women, my practice has been always about life, about optimism, about how can we still, even from the rubble, still understanding how to act differently, how to actually shape the reality we are living in. And unfortunately, I feel in this period as if death is taking over, and I have to admit that I am, I even don't know how to behave anymore. If being in a lecture like this is the right thing, if boycotting lectures within Western institution is even stronger, if to be with people that wants to support us is the right thing, if silence is the right thing, or speaking is another, that we cannot be silenced in this moment. So I have to admit that I am not sure what to do, how to do. I normally, I'm way more I have confidence in what we do, as at least it worked for us. It was a way for us to be able to still be living under Israeli colonialism, fighting that colonialism, to still be working inside Western institutions, fighting that Western institutions. But in this moment like this, I sort of feel a bit that I'm lost, I have to say. I'm from one side, I'm lost, I'm powerless, not sure what to do. And this is exactly from where I am speaking today. I mean, a lot of times they ask us to position ourselves, but in this moment, I cannot position myself, if not saying I am extremely powerless and feeling that all what we do is useless as long as these bombs are going up on top of Gaza. Maybe it's a bit of we have some each time I do a lecture or be in the public, I feel I got one of these bills as a sort of pain relief for few hours being in a collectivity, but then, you know, coming back to the news, I am again in the same exact thing. So I only wanted to acknowledge that together with all of you, and maybe a bit trying also to, I have to say, to try also to take that challenge to be in conversation with Yousif, because I came here with the pretest of speaking about the refugee heritage, but I think hearing you in this moment, I'm a little bit shifting within my uncertainty. I will still be taking you within my uncertainty. I will try to understand how to shift and maybe also interact with you, because maybe these are the moments where interacting makes sense. And maybe I want to take the challenge of, you know, you spoke about different things. Maybe, you know, at that moment, a bit of hospitality, and you referred to Derrida. And I really would like to take that maybe thing and begin to say, when I was working in, I worked in refugee camps for quite a long time, and I was always I mean, impressed maybe is the right word, or seeing that, I mean, it's all over Palestine, I have to say, not only in refugee camps, but refugees has this in a very strong way, where wherever you move in a refugee camp, they insist always in inviting you to their houses. This is something, and even, you know, whenever foreigners comes or people that from outside of the camp are moving within these camps, the first act that people will do is to invite you indeed to their living rooms, right? And I always thought about, as an architect, of course, each one of us works from his own sort of perspective. I began really to think about the role of the living room in our societies. And this is definitely, it was not only when I began to work, and especially in refugee camps, but I am also a result of the first Intifada. I was 14 years old when the first Intifada began in Palestine. And this is also, it's extremely important actually to, I'm 50 years old, and during my 50 years old, I have been resisting as a Palestinian, and sometimes for long times it was a non-violent resistance, other times it was a powerlessness, other time it was shouting and protesting, other times it was, we tried it all. We really tried it all in somehow. So things did not begin on the 7th of October for Palestinians. Things began way earlier, and I am 50 years old, and I born under occupation, under Israeli colonial regime. So it's not, I mean, my own body tells that this did not begin on the 7th of October, right? So just also to put the basics in the room was, and in that sense, when I was 14 years old, I had this moment. I was born in a town south of Bethlehem called Beit Sahur, that at a certain point became famous of what was called the White Intifada. And the White Intifada at that time was that people from Beit Sahur decided not to pay any more taxes for the Israeli colonial regime, to throw away their cards, their ID cards, and to begin completely a process of self-determination, to a point that we began to plan together with others. I mean, Beit Sahur was a bit extreme in that sense, but all the West Bank during the first Intifada did the same thing, where whatever empty land was taken, we began to plant. We even had cows to have our own milk. And Israelis put us under a 40 days of curfew, because they realized that if we will manage and show the world that we, and the world and the rest of the Palestinians, that we have the ability for that kind of self-determination, this will break the image of the oppressed, right? So somehow I was a result of that situation, where when schools were closed, universities were closed, I saw my parents together with neighbors and other people, setting schools inside living rooms in few days' time. They only says who are the teachers around, who are the students, how many empty living rooms do we have, and a school was created for months and years where we were, as students, actually knowing that by us only learning our right for self-determination, we were actually breaking the colonial power, right? And in that moment, it became, I understood the power of learning, the power of challenging that idea that we need our colonizers in order to survive, right? So I have to say, I am absolutely the result of a community that decided completely to get into a process of self-determination by planting, eating what they plant, organizing their own schools. I'm sorry, I have a cough since a week and I have hard time to manage that cough, so please bear with me. And in that sense, you know, this power of the domestic and the living room stayed with me forever. And when I studied in Europe and in Western societies where it was all about the public, right? That the collectivity comes from the public, that it is about the public school, that the private almost is the evil, is that, you know, the capitalism is absolutely linked to the private rather than to the public. I realized that, you know, it's this comes from a very welfare-centered societies, right, where they still have this relation with the state, while the moment that the state is your enemy, the state is your colonizer, the street is not yours, your living rooms becomes an extremely important spaces for political subjectivity, for political agency. And therefore, as an architect, I put it on me as a task of understanding the role of the living room as a space for self-representation, and even I would add to this as a space for self-determination. How can we understand the living room in that sense as the square or the plaza, the public plaza that is not given to the oppressed people, to the indigenous people that have no space to represent themselves, but not throughout their living rooms and their houses and their spaces where they can actually be hidden. In that sense, they cannot protest, they cannot go out. So the living room begins to play an extremely important role. And in that sense, I want to arrive to the hospitality and why I do believe that this is extremely linked to the hospitality, because if we accept that the living room is that space for self-representation and political subjectivity, then I would absolutely understand. And if we will actually follow Derrida in his analysis of that hospitality is power, then how can we use hospitality and understanding, of course, also the living room as the space for self-determination and self-representation becomes the space, obviously, where refugees, instead of being seen as relief recipients and numbers, the moment that they bring you in their living rooms, they immediately, and they are the one hosting you with power, they immediately gain that agency that they know that they have, right? It's not, but they simply, within your blindness, they show you that they exist, that they are political subjects, that they are political agents, right? So in somehow, I think in a sense, this has been a major for me as also understanding decolonization arriving to Europe, where indeed what really happened is that, and this is why we are all as migrants and refugees kept guests forever, because being hosts and realizing ourselves as political subjects, this would demand from Europe to revise what being a multicultural society might mean, right? The moment that we want to be not only guests, indeed, why they tell us each time we arrive in a place that we should learn how to behave, right? I mean, who behave are the good guests. But I would in here like actually to return back to an Islamic hadith that for me is quite radical, and then to end with Derrida, where this Islamic hadith says hospitality, it's in Arabic, الضيافة ثلاثة أيام وما بعد فصدقة. And that means hospitality is for 3 days, and after that, it becomes charity, right? And in Arabic, if you will think the word ضيافة and dafa, in Arabic, the hospitality does not have, if Derrida refer to it as hostage and host, in Arabic, we don't have this in the hospitality. Hospitality comes from the word adding. So we understand hospitality as adding to each other's, because hospitality can exist only for 3 days. It's temporary, where we got the best of ourselves. And we know that this cannot be after 3 days. And indeed, this is why we ask our guests in the Arabic culture after 3 days his name, because at that point, that person would become neighbor. And neighbor comes from the origin jara, which is mujawara and jara, and jara is the neighboring in Arabic, is what holds the hostage and the host, right? It is that place where we can, as human, negotiate and get the good and bad of ourselves. So in that sense, for me, being and working in refugee camps and moving then to Europe, I understood that one major point when it comes to hospitality, if we don't understand hospitality only as temporary for 3 days and keep people guests forever, means 2 things. Means that the hosts that are kept hospitality forever have a very colonial DNA, right? I mean, this is a very, I would challenge Derrida in that sense and says, even to be unconditional hosts, it's colonial. Unconditional hosts means that I accept even to give you the best of what I have, but I want to keep the power of my hosting. And being guests forever means that you do not have political subjectivity. And in that sense, for me, that is extremely important, seeing refugees always insisting in hosting, because they understand that the moment that they are hosting in that space, in that living room, they gain back their political subjectivity. And the camps as such, the 59 Palestinian camp in the Middle East, I think hospitality is still a major practice of self-determination and demanding self-agency and subjectivity. And I will maybe pass back to Yousif, because it has been really, I mean, I'm completely changing, I have to say, my lecture, but I like that very much, because it's a way for us to still be interacting. This was not meant to be, but I hope we can cope with it.
Just to add to Sandi's, in fact, words and also very important intervention, and of course, not in defense of Derrida, but the unconditional aspect or the impossibility of unconditional, in fact, hospitality. It questions, in fact, the host before the guest. And this is, in fact, a very important, I would say, problematic that Derrida wanted to expose within his writing. This is on the one hand. On the other, and here I would like, in fact, to start with my or our house in the camp and the lack of the living space, because not all refugees have the so-called living room, and not all refugees have spaces that are dissected and segmented in that way. So we make, in a sense, we make most of the space because of how congested and how overcrowded these spaces are. So we have just to remember also the very maybe genesis of the so-called living room, because because in the Arabic tradition, in fact, you have to go through something in order to protect the privacy of the inhabitants of the house. So I'm not so sure that I would maybe here talk about Badawi camp, that the living room is a fixity within the architecture of these houses. We had to wait for my grandparents to die, in fact, to expand a bit and to be able to stretch our legs. And I'm one of 11. So, and we shared only 2 rooms. So the living space is not there for us. And we have, this is how we talk about our house, as in we've got 2 rooms. To go back to hospitality and here I have to refer myself to the Arabic etymology. In fact, something that is very, very important, and people tend to forget it, that even though ضيف and مضيف are cognates, in fact, ضيف as a guest is considered more credible as a word in the Arabic language, because it constitutes what we call al-jadhr. And then mudif, in fact, is a word that is constructed by adding extras. And this is, in fact, a tendency and I would say a shift that we need to pay attention to. With reference to charity and the 3 days, etc., I think that we have to think about also the landscape. When Palestinians in Nahr al-Bared needed, when the camp itself in 2007 was razed to the ground, of course, these people had to go in terms of a proximity and settle in the Badawi camp. But also we have to remember that it is, and this is something that, in fact, my wife, who's a scholar, Elena Fidian Qasmiyeh, has written extensively on this refugee relationality. So we shouldn't idealize, because it is also important to acknowledge the scarcity of things. It's very important to underline the circumstances upon which, of course, these places are built. So, of course, we host, but we host, and then things do sadly change and differ. And I, just to stay with, of course, I didn't talk about Gaza because I feel really unable to speak about something that is so enormous and so severe, and people respond to these things differently. So what I'm going to do is to read a couple of things from Writing the Camp. And in fact, I would like to read anthropologists and how the refugee camp is seen at times as a place for research, but also, in fact, as a place for certain visitors where data and information and the statistics, etc., are gathered. And this is my, as I said earlier, writing afresh. This is not to antagonize anthropologists, but to maybe to highlight this maybe imbalance in power. Anthropologists, I know some of them are friends, but the majority are enemies. Upon the doorstep, you observe what they observe with a lot of care. You look at them the way they look at you, curiously and obliquely. You suddenly develop a fear of imitating them whilst they imitate you. You worry about relapsing into one of your minds while sharing mundane details with them. Sometimes I dream of devouring all of them, and just once, with no witnesses or written testimonies. All of us wanted to greet her, even my illiterate mother, who never spoke a word of English, said welcome. After spending hours with us in the same room, she left with a jar of homemade pickles and the 3 full cassettes with our voices. And I would like to conclude, in fact, my second intervention with the poem, The Bomb Shelter. And of course, just to maybe to contextualize the term itself and how in the Arabic language, in fact, the word refugee and the word bomb shelter are cognates. So they share the same root, which has to do with seeking refuge. The bomb shelter, the camp's alibi for a presence susceptible to its presence. The private parts of the dead, circumcised with hindsight, guts as road signs or a map, ruins summoning ruins, ruins fornicating ruins. The precarious is the non-existent. There, in the much deliberated existence, will always be a missing limb. Who stayed behind to count the void that is, a shelter to come and a camp that is? In the canon of dust, the camp deprived of its shadow is a shelter. Only dust departs and remains at once. When they built it, they carved its past out of God's shoulder. In the consequence of time, the shoulder shall return to God, a severed time. The shelter's guardian, who, to the best of my knowledge, was not Palestinian, had a lisp, and around his discolored neck was a chain with a bullet casing for decoration. My son, anger not a stray bullet, remain in a place that was. By shadowing its coming, the camp mimics the future. The string my father used to pull his tooth out as the bombs were falling snapped in half. 2 almost equal strings suspended in total darkness, awaiting new blood. Declare it, even if God is certain of that which long passed. In good time, time cuts the throat of time. A tomb for the hesitant, a wreath for men and metals. No clouds for the face, water for the tomb, and the house plants. In my naked eye, I saw my sister running away from a bomb, stark naked, save her eyes. When we left the bomb shelter, our dusty faces stayed behind. Inside is where we swapped faces in haste. It's still war, so no remembering to be remembered behind those walls. But the nests for the hovering metal outside, time is tomorrow. Or could it not be that which was not? It is still war, according to their pulses. On their lips, God recites the I, the pierced eye, eyes to the extent of not seeing the Buddha as the dual. Outside the place, the indifference to all beyond dying, the indifference to the indifferent death, to the binding in time. There is some time in waiting, the pail tentatively suspended from the handle, a dry well in the vicinity, feigning sound. In the bomb shelter, I wet myself so I would mark my spot. The wailing inside never ended, to the extent of our dialect becoming wailing. Thank you.
Thank you, Yousif. And maybe I would like actually also to share with you how at the end of the day, I am an architect and artist, and I think it's extremely important to understand how understanding that power structure within the space building makes quite an incredible difference. And in that sense, I would like to share with you my screen. And this is the website, and I'm going to the project called Al-Madafa, or the living room, which is project that is trying to act upon what does it mean indeed using the living room. And in that sense, I don't use the living room as that you need a space of the living room, but you need a space where hospitality is defined, because in somehow what happens all the time is that in the public, they make us feel as if there is no guest and host, but matter of fact, the state is the host, right? And in that sense, if you feel yourself guest for eternity and you are kept guest forever, in which way you regain back your political agency? And I want to show you this project. This project was done in the north of Sweden, in a city called Boden, where this is a building that is full of refugees arriving to the north of Sweden in that kind of landscape. And in some way, the hardest part of everything is that this kind of architecture is extremely made for people not to meet. I mean, it is purposely done. This kind of modern architecture is made for people not to meet, not to have interaction with each other. And being there, the strongest part of what I heard from refugees is that what they miss is the most is a possibility of someone knocking their door, of someone of interacting with someone or with each other or with the rest of the city. So what indeed we did is simply, I mean, in somehow to open up a corner of that place and turn it into a madafa. In Arabic, the madafa is a space for hosting, right? And this would become the space of hosting that you would see from outside, and people will begin to come to it and will begin to interact with each other and to host. And at a certain point, they would even begin, this would last for 4 years, they begin to host politicians, right? And to demand their right to be host and not only to be guests. But not only politicians, they would begin, and at that small scale of cities, cultural institutions like began to think refugees, and especially such cities became a very important cities for refugees because they are peripheral, they are away, and refugees are sent there, and suddenly their institutions have refugees as their main audience, speaking about Red Cross, speaking about cultural institutions. And at that point, they began to tell them, yes, of course, we would like to come and be host in your culture, but why not to host you, right? And at that point, they began to host politicians, speak with the city, and suddenly they began really to be quite a presence in the city. And guess what? After 4 years of the living room being there, at the end of the day, the migration offices decide actually to close the place without any announcement. And in somehow, when I tried, I mean, this is a project that was commissioned by a state, which is the Public Art Agency, preserved by a state, which is Moderna Mosaic, while they were closing it by the migration office, which is state. None of them were speaking to each other, but being left completely without explanation. My only explanation that migration office is only able, a migration officer was only used only to be dealing with charity when they dealing with refugees. The moment that they began to say, I am not charity, I am here to host you in a place where you don't necessarily understand all the time the language, the food. You need to behave as a guest, right? Even if you are a mayor of that city, you need to behave as a guest. And I do believe that it requires from a migration officer to accept to be a guest at a refugee house. And this was not possible. They closed the project with no explanation. In a place like Sweden, that they claim democracy, they claim that they are open welfare state, that they speak about everything. In that sense, what I would like to stress is that indeed, in these kinds of projects, when we understand our right not to be only a guest, but to be hosts, we shift the power practice, right? This is one, but it did not only happen in there. What also, coming back to the living room, sorry, in here, which is, you can of course go, there are different living rooms that there was done. This is a living room that was done at the entrance of the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven. And at that point, it was, again, it lasts for 4 years. It will be closing on the 7th of November. And guess what? I mean, for example, when we all understand the double standards that Europe has been using during the war of Ukraine, which is, again, same and same. Now, why Ukrainians and not Palestinians? But that living room was a living room where, you know, people began to host. They are refugees, migrants, and in somehow it first break this whole class issue, because at a certain point, you know, they would be meeting with diplomats, with lawyers, with people from society. I mean, we know who are the visitors of museums normally. And in that sense, being hosts, they managed to shift and challenge that class issue. But also, they began within the museum itself. When the museum put the Ukrainian flags up, people went there because they are hosts, because they are at the entrance of the museum. They went back to the director of the museum and says, why don't we see a Syrian flag there? Why don't we see an Afghani flag there? And they began to negotiate. And you know what? Because they have a madafa. They have a space from where to talk. They are not talking as being included in the institution. They are talking from their own frame. And this is what I intend by the living room, in which way we are not only included, but we host in our frame, we host you in our frame, and you host us in yours. I am super fine. But I think what is happening in this moment is that, and the oppression I feel as a Palestinian more and more in this particular moment, is that they want you to be included in their frame, and they even checked you with certain questions you are asked in order to be able to be included in their living room. I don't want to be included anymore. I am one, I want to meet you at the threshold. I want to be a host and a guest in the same time, because if I am not, then I simply accept to be in your framework forever. And this is valid for pedagogy, for universities, and so what I intend normally with the living rooms is not to have really the space of the living room, but the spatial frame, the spatial knowledge that would permit us to ask who is the guest and who is the host in this moment, not who is included, the colors that are inside, how many people that are from different cultures that are inside that frame, but I want to know who is hosting in that frame, who is hosting the discourse, who is hosting what is going on, who is controlling who is getting in and who is getting out, becomes extremely important. As an architect, I understand this as the space of the living room, because it permits me to ask these questions, right? So in that sense, I think I wanted to stress, what do I really intend by the living room? I don't intend a physical living room. I really intend what are spaces that are able to change power structures for people that are only finding themselves a lot of time only included within a frame. Is there a possibility of living in a society where it's made of so many living rooms and we can discuss our frames? Or as it's happening in this moment in this war, that either you are civilized or you are barbarian, right? And they want immediately to put you, where is it that you stand? What frame you will include yourself in? Can we live in a society that accept complexity, that accept different frames, that will negotiate these frames? Or I see all the time things closing and closing to a point where we are arriving. I mean, Palestine, Israel is not only a separate issue. Palestine, Israel is around power structure and around, for me, having only one big living room that speaks for the rest of the living rooms in the world, not only in a particular society. So this is really where I would like to problematize the role of the guest and the host.
Thank you so much, Yousif and Sandi, for this heartfelt discussion. It was incredible to hear you both speak from the heart, and thank you for your vulnerability. And we all wish it was in a different circumstances, but we're very grateful to have had this conversation. Perhaps now then we can move on to the questions and answers, if that's suitable for everyone.
Do refugee camps have history? This was the fundamental question at the base of the nomination of the Haisha refugee camp as UNESCO World Heritage Site. Refugee camps are established with the intention of being demolished. They are not accepted to have a history or a future. They are meant to be forgotten. The history of refugee camps is constantly erased, dismissed by states, humanitarian organizations, international agencies, and even by refugee community themselves, in fear that any acknowledgement of the present undermines their right of return. The only history, in fact, that is recognized within refugee communities is one of violence, suffering, and humiliation. How then we understand the life and the culture that people built in camps, despite suffering and marginalization? The photo that you see here are part of the UNESCO dossier produced in over 2 years of discussions with refugee communities, local residents, heritage experts, and cultural producers. Members of the camp strongly expressed their fear that the nomination would change the status quo and threaten to undermine the legally recognized right of return. At the same time, many expressed their desire to see refugee history being acknowledged and attempt to bring back the right of return at the center of the political discussion. We were interested here in documenting the life, the spaces, and the political structures that emerge in almost 7 decades of exile. Palestinian camps are not made anymore of tents. They are complex urban structure, and we don't have the right vocabulary to understand and describe this forced condition of permanent temporariness. In understanding today's refugee condition beyond the humanitarian crisis, refugee heritage traces, documents, reveals, and represent refugee history beyond the narrative of suffering and displacement.
خلدة، قطرة، التينة، القسطينة، تل الترمس، الفالوجة، عراق المنشية، القبيبة، الدوايمة، بيت جبرين، بيت نتيف، علار، خربة التنور، راس أبو عمار، القبو، بيت عطاب، سفلة، بيت محسير، الشوع، عسلين، صرعة، عرطوف، دير رفات، دير الهوى، لفتة، دير ياسين، عين كارم، المالحة، سطاف، صوبة، خربة اللوز، كسلة، ديربان، الجورة، زكريا، البريج، كدنة، ذكرين، دير الدبان، دير الشيخ، جرش، مغلس، عجور، الولجة. These are the names of the villages of origin of which Palestinians were expelled and now reside in the Heysha refugee camp. Israel demolished more than 300 villages in 1948 in order to prevent Palestinians from returning to their homes. Today, only a few public buildings like schools, mosques, and cemeteries are standing as material evidence to the expulsion of the Palestinians. Today, these villages have for the most part been substituted with exclusive Jewish Israeli towns, national parks, and industrial areas. Refugee camps and villages of origin are associated with the same history of displacement and dispossession. They are both in legal limbo and suspended. On the one hand, the camp is a permanent temporary space of emergency carved out of the state sovereignty. While on the other hand, the village is legally defined by the Israeli state as absentee property. Despite their geographical separations, the two sides clearly have direct links and connections. Therefore, we see the possibility and the urgency of nominating the Haisha refugee camp and the 44 villages of origin as a serial transboundary World Heritage Site according to the UNESCO World Heritage Site criteria.